For the past 2 decades, Arab American and Muslim voters have overwhelmingly voted blue. But like many other voting blocs, Donald Trump has scrambled what we thought we knew. He did surprisingly well with Muslim voters. And now that he has been elected and begun forming his cabinet, Arab Americans and Muslims are watching to see how their interests will be represented in this new administration. Journalist Ed Jelani is here to discuss a piece he wrote this week about all of this and what he wants to see from the Trump presidency in the Middle East specifically. Welcome, Zed. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
You're a person who I have many fundamental disagreements with, and I'm so privileged and honored to still call a friend. You keep me honest in so many ways, and so I'm so grateful that you're here. Let's start by just getting the final tallies. What percentage of Muslim voters did Donald Trump ultimately win? How many went for Jill Stein? How many went for Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to speak to the overall numbers because one, it's a small group that's kind of spread out among many states, and two, I think many places didn't do exit polls that I think would have had the precision to really get at the numbers. That being said, we do have some sort of data both before the vote took place and also after the vote took place that would suggest that Trump's performance was likely, I would say, the best performance for a Republican presidential candidate in probably around 20 years with this group. Prior to the vote taking place, Arab American Institute did polling that suggested that Trump and Kamala Harris were splitting the vote about equal,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that Republicans were going from earning less than 30% of the vote all the way up to 45, closer to 50% of the vote among Arab Americans. CARE had done similar polling showing that Trump was getting more votes than Kamala Harris. And then when we actually saw the vote take place, one way you could see how the candidates did is by looking at some districts where we know what the population is like, right? So, one of the big states or epicenters where people were looking at this was in Michigan, right? And so outside of Detroit, in the suburbs of Dearborn, you have very large Arab American populations, also in Hamtramck and in other places. And in those places, Trump actually won, I think, something like a 47% or higher percent of the vote in some of these places, which suggests that if those places are a bellwether for the rest of the country, that it's possible that Trump won just shy of a majority of the vote of many Arab American communities and also Muslim American communities. I think also when you look at the vote in certain places like Northern Virginia, right? People were curious why was Kamala Harris so soft in Northern Virginia? Well, I don't think anyone ran exit polls specifically about Muslim Americans there, but the population in Northern Virginia is about a quarter million Muslim, right? And I imagine that a lot of the softness in that region had to do with people breaking for Trump. I think this is something that anecdotally, you talk to anyone who's in this space writing about this, like Shadi Hamid, you'll find friends and family who had voting Republican who hadn't done that in decades. So I think there's very strong evidence that Trump's performance was, far above and beyond what Republicans normally get. I don't really know what the final performance was like because I don't think there has been a whole ton of polling being done that's very precise about the group after the vote was cast. But the pre-election polling suggests that, and also some of the results in some of the geographic areas where we know that Trump actually exceeded Kamala Harris's vote in terms of where we know the populations of Arab Americans, Muslim Americans are in many parts of the country.
So the big question is why, right? Donald Trump is famously incredibly pro-Israel. His first administration, he had the Abraham Accords. He moved the embassy
Mhm.
to Jerusalem. He recognized the Golan Heights, a lot of things that made pro-Israel people extremely happy, but, presaged a kind of fall off from Muslim voters. And in fact, what we saw was the opposite. So how do you explain that? I mean, I think there's sort of two ways to see that. Either the fact that, Americans are not voting on foreign policy, only 4% prioritize foreign policy. There are a lot of pressing issues, especially for working class Americans. But there's a sort of another view that I heard from actually a Palestinian friend of mine who lives in Kenosha. He's an Uber driver. And he told me he's voting for Trump because he thinks Trump will end the war. There was this view that sort of you saw emerging where Palestinian Americans actually thought that Trump would be better for them long term. So which of those views do you think holds more water, and how do you explain this phenomenon?
Yeah, so I think there are two or three different issues going on. So something that if people paid close attention and to Michigan in particular is that they would see that actually the Republicans were gaining a little bit of ground even before there was any war in Gaza, right?
Mm.
So in 2023, I think there were heated debates in some Arab American communities and in Michigan about educational issues, about social issues, where they actually lean a little bit more towards the Republicans, right? They felt like there needs to be less of a focus on LGBTQ stuff in schools. There needs to be less sort of city and state endorsement of those policies or viewpoints. And I think Republicans actually started to make inroads, even if you look at some of the local elections there. But at the same time, I think that that could just be partly like a reversion, right? Because you have to remember through the year like 2000, the Arab American vote was heavily Republican leaning. I think in the 2000 election, Bush actually got something like 80% of the Muslim American vote, right?
Wow.
The main section that he didn't get were the African American Muslims, right? Because they tend to be strong
Mhm.
Democrats as the larger African American population is. But that kind of dropped off after the war in Iraq and so on and so forth. And actually, if you want to laugh a little bit, go back and read an article by Franklin Foer in the New Republic where he accused Grover Norquist of helping Bush recruit radical Islamists for his campaign. This was back when this group, when Muslims were not voting for Democrats. This is how a lot of Democrats talked about them, which was funny. But a lot of that dropped off after the war in Iraq, and I think that gradually a lot of people in this group became Democrats just through socialization, right? Like you voted for Democrats in one election,
Mhm.
they start recruiting you more into their party, you adopt more of their viewpoints, so on and so forth. But I do think that the foreign, I do think that the wars overseas did help serve as like a breaking point, right? I think a lot of like Arab and Muslim Democrats had voted Democrat because they had suggested, well, at least on this one issue, they're a little bit more sympathetic to us, right? We disagree with them about small business, we might disagree with them about some social cultural issues, might disagree with them about taxes, but on this one issue, they have more of an open ear to us. But I think actually first the Biden team and then the Kamala Harris's presidential campaign kind of screwed up the outreach and communication to this group once the war had started, and the Trump team was just very very aggressive, right? So like Rich Grenell, who was a diplomat and director of national intelligence under Trump and was part of the Trump campaign. I think he did like over 100 meetings in Michigan with people. The father of Trump's son-in-law, Lebanese father,
Mhm.
Trump's son-in-law, who just was appointed as an advisor to Trump on Middle Eastern affairs. He worked the ground very, very aggressively in many Arab American communities. And I think the message they were giving to people was kind of the twofold one that we're discussing. One, we are closer to you guys on these social, cultural, domestic issues, and we both know it, right? Like this is something where we're not going to be pushing gender ideology on your kids in school. We'll help you in those fights. And then the second, I think, with the message was a little bit vaguer, but also it was just fundamentally true, which was like, look, we may not see eye to eye on everything in the Middle East, but look at what's happening right now, right? Under us, we had the Abraham Accords. Under us, we had quiet, right? You didn't agree with everything we did, but there wasn't this war. And at the same time, there's no end in sight under Biden and Harris. So I think this kind of twofold approach that they had pursued was actually quite successful, right? They understood how to reach out to this community. At one point I saw a mailer they were using in Michigan, the Trump people, and it said something like, no new wars, family values, and high prices of groceries or something, right? And I was like, that's perfect. Like those three messages are basically all you need for this community. You don't need to make it any more complicated than
Mhm.
that. And look, I think it worked out for them. They invested in this strategy in battleground states, particularly in Michigan, but I think it may have also helped them in some other states like Virginia and Georgia. And I think it ended up working very well. As far as the issue of what will happen now, will this deliver? Will these voters stay Republicans? That's a bigger question, I think.
So you wrote this great piece for us at Newsweek. The headline was Trump has a lot of leverage in the Middle East. He should use it to help the Palestinians. Walk us through the argument that you make and what you think Muslim Americans who care a lot about this issue, understandably, want to see from a Trump administration.
Yeah, so I think the single biggest foreign policy achievement of President Trump in his first term was probably the Abraham Accords, right? Which were bringing into place normalization agreements between Israel and several other countries, most of them Middle Eastern Arab majority countries, right? And I think a lot of people were cynical about those agreements
Mhm.
because they said, well, these countries are not at war with Israel anyway, and they kind of were moving in that direction anyway. And it didn't include the Palestinian question, right? Like the Arab League in the early 2000s was like, hey, we will all normalize with you. You just have to make sure we get a Palestinian state out of it
Right.
too. That never happened, right? So a
Right.
lot of people saw, well, that I was kind of skipping over that kind of crucial question.
Mhm.
But just because it was kind of founded that way doesn't mean that it's not useful going forward. I think the Abraham Accords could actually be very useful to bringing this to a resolution because it's quite obvious that Saudi Arabia and other countries want to be part of it. They've seen it being beneficial for the countries who are part of it. And really, they don't have any fundamental beef with Israel beyond, I think, the Palestinian issue. But that issue could still be leveraged, I think, to bring this all to a resolution, right? So, like, somebody has to rebuild Gaza, right? Somebody has to provide some kind of administrative infrastructure to exist there before it's handed off to Palestinians again, because really, not much is left. The Palestinian Authority can't really do it, and Israel doesn't really like them right now, and that's going to take some work on diplomacy. But Israel desperately wants to see more people in the Abraham Accords as well. And I think that the people who are involved in Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition were very hesitant to agree to a ceasefire under and an end to the war under President Biden, just because I don't think they have a good relationship with
Mhm.
Biden nor with the Democrats. And to some extent, that's true with the Gulf as well, right? I don't think the Gulf has a
Mhm.
great relationship with Biden and the Democrats. But they do have a relatively better relationship with Trump. I don't think they agree with him on everything, but they do have a better relationship with him. And I think if I'm sitting in Benjamin Netanyahu's shoes and I have to get people to my right in my coalition to agree to some kind of resolution to the conflict, I mean the short-term conflict, not like in the long term, but the short-term conflict, I think I have to be able to give them something, right? I can't just
Mhm.
say, well, we're just going to end the war because Trump wants us to end the war and Trump campaigned on it. I think he has to be able to tell them, look, I know that Itamar Ben-Gvir, want to go set up a condo in Gaza, and Smotrich, you want to annex the West Bank, and like you want to use this as like the fulfillment of your religious prophecy, but maybe we can't do that right now. But hey, we can have a great relationship with Saudi Arabia. We can have robust trade and diplomacy and cultural exchange with Saudi Arabia, with a lot of these other Arab majority countries that are fully ready to normalize with us. They just can't do it on the backs of this war, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's actually a pretty good deal to present to those folks, because ultimately they do have to be won over. Unless Israel has an election, which I don't think is happening anytime soon, where they're deposed and maybe a centrist government comes to power that can do it instead. They have to have some kind of leverage to bring them into the fold. And I think that Biden was very kind of hesitant to use any kind of sticks in this situation. We have carrots and sticks in diplomacy. And I think Trump probably would be too, also hesitant to do that, given his political coalition and the people he surrounded himself with. But in terms of who can deliver better carrots, it's almost you can make a case that Trump could, right? When you're trying to diplomatically engage with people, and your main argument is persuasion, it really does depend on having the best relationship with them, right? And I think a lot of people on the left were dispirited when Trump appointed so many people like Governor Huckabee and others who I think have more of a dispensationalist, religious worldview and are very, very kind of supportive of Israel's government in that way. But the upside of it is that these are also people that the Israelis can kind of trust. They know that they won't stab them in the back. They know that they will defend them in international forums. They know that they'll keep all kinds of engagement going. And sometimes, if you're trying to win over someone's trust to have them do something for you, it's good to be able to assuage their concerns in that way, right? But I think a lot of it does depend on just Trump being able to put his foot down and saying he really wants to get it done.
Mhm.
Because I think he does. I think he genuinely does. I think there are a lot of signs that the Trump people would like to see an end to the conflict by the time he takes office in January, right? They've sent that through intermediaries. He's kind of implied that himself through his own remarks. And it's something that I think he could actually achieve in the short run. In the longer run, of course, I don't think just having a ceasefire is going to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't think
Mhm.
it'll end the issues between Iran and Israel and all the militant groups they finance and the nuclear program. Those are issues I think, though, that Trump could make progress on as well, right? I think that he has a little bit more ideological flexibility than your typical Republican. He's talked about how he wants to make a deal with Iran several times, in public. And I think he will start by, ramping up maximum pressure again, in terms of economic sanctions and so on and so forth, diplomatic pressures. But I think Trump needs to think about what his long-term legacy will look like, right? And it may take, kind of a bull in a china shop to get something done on that issue, right? I think one of the flaws of Joe Biden was that his administration was very dithering. His administration was dithering in pretty much every aspect, from the U.S. Mexico border to inflation, to supply chain crises, to we even had a crisis of getting babies formula out to people. Right at one point, mothers couldn't even find baby formula anywhere in America. And it took them months to create a strategy to deal with that. Uh, but Trump, I think one of his assets as a person, I mean, it's kind of a downside too, was that he doesn't. I don't think he suffers fools. Right? If he wants
Mhm.
something done, he will do it. And I think that if he really wants to drive not only an immediate ceasefire early next year to this current conflict, but also pushing towards some kind of longer term solution, whether it be a Palestinian state or at least expanded autonomy in some way. And also maybe larger agreements with Iran, both on the nuclear program and also on kind of their financing and military activities all over the region. I think if he really puts his foot down and drives for it, he can achieve it just because he's not a dithering person. I mean, he achieved a lot of actually quite remarkable things when he was president in the first term that people didn't think he would be able to do, from renegotiating NAFTA to passing a comprehensive criminal justice reform bill to actually stepping foot in North Korea and doing one-on-one diplomacy. I mean, who saw that coming, right? So I think he has the capability and the capacity. The only question is if he really has he has the will and determination to do it. I know he has a lot on his plate, and he's a busy man. But I do think this could be a cornerstone of his legacy and a way to really show that it was worth bringing him back into power, right, and getting rid of the Democrats. So
I cannot agree with you more. There's so much evidence that he wants the ceasefire before he enters office. I've been saying from the minute that he won, he's not gonna give Bibi Netanyahu, excuse me, a free reign. He's going to say to him, "You have 3 weeks to finish this. I'll give you cover for 3 weeks, and then I want it over," because Trump fundamentally hates war. He thinks it's totally wasteful, and he hates waste. And I think you're already seeing that the Qataris are talking about how all of the pressure is already on. He doesn't want to finish this when he gets into office. He wants to walk into office on January 21st and have this be already resolved, which I think is incredible. I think the Muslim voters who trusted him are going to be very much rewarded. And I totally agree with you that he has the capacity to really bring Saudi Arabia to the table and to really create some sort of lasting peace here. And I think that he does have the will. I think he's thinking now about his legacy and what that will look like. But I think that the way that he sort of destroyed the liberal view of how to bring peace to the Middle East, which was the kind of Biden administration. Well, you dither. Well, you sort of you give sort of you're soft on Hamas, right? Trump is out there tweeting, "You better release those hostages immediately." And the comment people were making on Twitter was, "Trump speaks Arabic," right? He understands that if you bring a liberal mentality, you're not going to bring civil rights to the
I think
Palestinians.
no, I think it's funny that his Middle East team really is rich people that he knows and like his extended family. And I was thinking he basically is a Gulf Arab.
Totally.
That's the kind of team you would put together if you were in if you were in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or
Yeah,
one of the
no,
Gulf states. So
there's a great story that Jason Greenblatt, who was part of the team that negotiated the Abraham Accords. He's an Orthodox Jew. So is David Friedman, right? These are Orthodox Jews who sort of travel with their big families of 6 children and demand kosher food when they go to the United Arab Emirates, right? And of course, no liberal would do that. But of course, this is something that a religious Muslim would have deep respect for, right? Because, game
right.
recognized game, right? So I guess my last question for you would be, so what happens to the intersectional coalition here domestically going forward? I mean, so much was blown up. I think you're totally spot on by saying, that there was intimations that this was sort of a fake coalition when religious Muslims were saying, "Why are you bringing gender ideology into my child's school?" And one of the tragedies, of the war was that there was a nice, beautiful emerging coalition between Orthodox Jews and religious Muslims to push back against this, which I hope will be recovered soon. What happens to the left? What happens to the intersectional coalition when voters are standing up for what they actually truly believe in and thinking for themselves?
Look, I think that if you look at pretty much every election going back through probably 2008 or even 2006, they've been change elections, right? Like we've had so many backlashes, changing in power between one side to another. And I think part of the reason why that is because neither side really figured out how to govern like as well as they
Mm.
used to, right? Like the sustainability and durability of something like the New Deal coalition following Franklin Roosevelt's elections, or the sustainability and durability of something like the Reagan coalition during Reagan's term, has just not been found by the current parties, right? And I think when it came to the Democrats, one, I think they were dipping into a lot of social cultural issues where they were kind of pushing the window in a way that their own base really didn't want, right? In a way that a lot of Black and Latino voters in particular just really weren't into. And then two, I think they really fell asleep when it came to the issue of inflation and what was happening to American families, right? I think they kept pushing this idea that it was transitional, that it was not going to last very long, and that it was, by the way, it was worth it compared to what they were doing with full employment economy based on their spending priorities and the regulatory priorities. And look, I think their coalition kind of fell apart, right? The Kamala Harris had the worst performance among Black voters of any Democrat in almost half a century, right? Like that's sure she still won the lion's share, but if that trend continued, right, it'd be kind of Rui Tejera told me it'd be the death knell for Democrats if that
Hmm.
trend continued, right? So I think a lot of this is going to be a matter of whether the Republicans can govern, right? Like, how are they going to approach the tax reform law, the reauthorization of that next year, right? Like, are they going to prioritize shifting more dollars into the hands of working families and addressing a lot of these emergent, like, issues with inflation and supply crises and so on and so forth? Or is it going to be like business as usual, right? Because
Hmm.
I think if it is business as usual, the Democrats can recover a lot of the voters they lost this
Hmm.
election because I don't think a lot of these voters who shifted into the Republican Party are like diehard MAGA people. I think they're people who are willing to give the Republicans a shot because the Democrats have screwed up governing a lot, and also because
Hmm.
I think Trump ran a pretty smart campaign in many ways, right? But I don't think that they're diehard conservatives or diehard Republicans. I think that will only come if the Republicans govern well, right? And I think that the Democrats one have to count on the Republicans not governing well, and then two, like they have to take a hard look at themselves in the mirror and say, what is it that Americans actually want? I mean, I think one of the problems with Kamala Harris is that she really didn't believe in much of anything, right? Like the reason she had to reinvent her entire worldview from 2020 is because she was just saying, a set of lines to impress
Hmm.
people in that year. And now she was saying set of lines to impress people this year. I think a lot of the debates on the left or among Democrats about how she should have messaged this, she should have messaged that, should have said this, said that, almost kind of fruitless or pointless because at the end of the day, people in their guts knew that she just wasn't telling you what she believed anyway, and she didn't really believe that much as is. I mean, the thing about Donald Trump that's a strength for him is that he's authentic, right? Like,
Hmm.
sure, like he tells tall tales, but he tells them kind of strategically, right? He tells them as someone who's like boasting or bragging, and like people understand that, like his fan base understands that about him. It's not a surprise, and they don't feel deceived. On the other hand, he'll actually tell you what he's thinking about things. Sometimes it may shock or offend or amuse, but he is who he is, right? And I think the Democrats kind of have to start being that, right? Like, don't
Hmm.
just go to consultants and activists and keep reinventing yourselves over and over. You have to put forward genuine people who have authentic connections to their communities, who are speaking from the top of their intelligence and the top of their minds. I think that's something that Obama did very well. I mean, I think we can all take issue with how he governed. I mean, I think he made a number of mistakes while governing, but as a politician, he was very capable because I think he was who he was. I think the two senators that represent me here in Georgia are the same way, right? I don't think that they are, fire breathing populists or anything, which I think a lot of the Democrats are arguing about right now. But I think they are who they are. I think
Hmm.
Reverend Warnock is a reverend who does what he believes, and I think John Ossoff is, a former reporter and an intellectual and a Jewish millennial who I think engages on things at the top of his intelligence. Like they are who they are in private is no different from who they are in public, right? And I think a lot of Georgians who voted for Brian Kemp were also willing to vote for Reverend Warnock
Hmm.
because they felt like both Kemp and Warnock are authentic, genuine people who are rooted in their communities, right? Who are rooted in Georgia and its history, and they're not, just siphons of Silicon Valley money or French consultants or whoever was controlling Kamala Harris at any point in her career, right? It depends. And so, yeah, I think that getting back to authenticity and connection will go a long way for the left, right? I think they will never have run into potholes like defunding the police or transgender children in every school, so on and so forth, if they just had an authentic connection with the communities they're supposed to represent, right? The more distance they had from those communities, the more they went into really weird places, right? I mean, that was the irony of Tim Walls's line about JD Vance or Republicans being weird, is that everybody knows the Democrats are the weird party, right? And that's not always bad. Like being weird could be a good thing. it's just like objectively true that the party that's trying to change society more and kind of take away traditional norms tends to be weirder. And sometimes weird can be bad in an election anyway, even if they're on the right side of history about something, it is weird. But I think it would be better for them to not be so weird and to have more of an authentic connection with these communities.
Zed, God bless you. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you'll come back very soon.